for perhaps the first time in his long and varying life, Beju felt no pleasure at seeing the familiar towers and skyline of Ayodhya appear on the horizon. As the Grama topped the hilly rise that led up from Mithila Bridge before trundling down the Rajmarg into the Saryu Valley, he felt none of the relief and satisfaction that his fellow PFs felt in that moment. Their gruff voices, several shot through with more than a little anger at their painful wounds and abject humiliation, rang out in the still dawn air around him, lending the Grama's last leg of travel a festive atmosphere. He did not share in it. All he felt right now was trepidation and gloom. His mood had not altered by the time the Grama rolled sonorously through the first gate and wound its way up Raghuvamsh Avenue to its destination, the Royal Quadrant. The high stone walls of the 8th gate only worsened his mood. Once, this had been a bustling intersection where citizens, merchants, and anyone and everyone had freely roved. A public space like all the rest of Ayodhya had been. It was hard to believe that was only a decade ago. Now, the forebodingly high stone wall that marked the end of the public sections of Ayodhya and the start of the highly restricted Royal Quadrant, was a symbol of the new Ayodhya, a city divided into two parts: one, the public prosperous trading and residential public city where almost a lack of citizens of all castes, creeds, and persuasions still lived in cosmopolitan harmony. They profited, worked with, and traded with one another. 2. The toy quadrant, where only 100 or so royally favored clans resided in luxuriant elegance, their lives, estates, and activities separated from the hustle and bustle of the outer city, the lower city as it had come to be called derisively of late, while they remained in the sheltered shadow of the fortress. For that was what the palatial complex had become now. A veritable fortress. Beju looked up despondently as the Grama entered through the trade gate of the Royal Quadrant. The front gate was only for royalty or the court-favored clans, and felt even more depressed at the sight of the massively reinforced structures that had been erected a decade ago and added to considerably in the intervening years, altering the once beautiful open architecture of the royal palace complex into an ugly, forbidding military enclosure. He sighed. As a soldier, he ought to have appreciated the superior protection these architectural changes provided to the royal Suryavansha Ikshwaku dynasty, which he was sworn to protect with his life. But as an Ayodhyan and Arya citizen, he felt more pity and sadness at what had been lost in order to gain this superior level of protection. Was it worth it in the end? He had never thought so, and today, feeling as despondent and morose as he did, he felt that the loss of the former beauty and sense of freedom and interconnectedness that the old layout had provided was too high a price to have paid for better defense. Much too high a price. He put thoughts of architecture and security out of his head as he pulled up the team before the cantonment stables. Men rushed forward to take the weary horses and tend to them, moving with military efficiency. It was the work of moments for the vital contents of the wagons to be unloaded and carried to a suitably safe location indoors where they would be barred and sealed and guarded closely and inventoried. He sighed, stretching his travel-weary limbs, and started towards the lockhouse with reluctant steps. Pradhan Mantri Jabli was already waiting by the entrance of the lockhouse, along with his munshis. Beju didn't like the minister. He hadn't liked him when he had been just a minister. He had liked him even less when he became war minister and his notorious war council was embedded as a permanent fixture instead of the ad hoc committee it used to be. Now, he actively disliked him as Pradhan Mantri. The chief of the ministers of the Sabha, the assembly that administered the kingdom and its capital city under the guidance and oversight of the king, ought not to be a bigoted, bad-tempered, self-righteous and overly pious warmongering old man. Especially when he had followed in the footsteps of Sumantra, perhaps the finest prime minister the Kosalan nation had ever had. Beju had never been high enough in the military chain of command to have been privy to the inner workings of Dashratha's government, but he hadn't needed to be. The results were there for all to see, from the highest Senapati to the lowest Sipahi. Those in Dashratha's army had been proud of the fact that the last Asura war had been 22 years ago and that peace had reigned supreme since then, a peace they took pride in being responsible for instituting and maintaining. Those in Rama's army, or, more accurately these days, Mantri Jabli's army, took pride in Ayodhya's military supremacy and how effectively intimidated even their closest allies were by that supremacy. Governance by cooperation versus governance by sword, Beju thought with more than a little bitterness. Like all old Kshatriyas, he believed that the true purpose of the warrior class was not to wage war and inflict violence, but to help preserve a state where neither was necessary. He did not speak such thoughts aloud. These days, under this regime, such thinking was considered treason. Jabli said sharply, pointing his forefinger accusingly. It seemed to Beju with the tip of the finger crooked, a result of the aging minister's advanced arthritis. Beju archly noted the curious resemblance between the angle of the crooked finger and the mantri's hooked nose. Open treason that must be punished at once. Beju sighed inwardly. He had expected this very reception. Although he had hoped for a few moments of respite before the haranguing began in earnest. And perhaps, Shaneshwara willing, a brief audience with Rama himself, so that I may try to put things in perspective before this old vulture twists it all out of recognition and embarks on another of his notorious demon hunts. He tried to put aside his weariness and despondency, and face the Pradhan Mantri squarely. Pradhan Mantri, allow me to explain what happened, he began. The Grama was waylaid by a band of brigands, the Prime Minister said loudly. Yes, I already have the facts. Now it is time to take action. Such an open act of treason must be punished most severely and swiftly, before word of it spreads to our disgruntled allies and encourages further rebellion. We must crush the offenders with an iron fist. Whose fist? Beju wondered bitterly. Not your own, I'm sure. Indeed, the minister's right fist lay curled like a misshapen claw by his side, the result of what appeared to be a particularly bad arthritic day in this bracing autumn weather. Pradhan Mantri, if you will let me narrate the exact events. Jabli jerked his bent finger dismissively. Don't waste your breath, boy, my people have told me everything already. I got word last night itself and have already taken appropriate action. Beju's heart sunk. Boy? At 68 years, still a boy? Pradhan Mantri, if I may suggest a diplomatic course of action that will hopefully avoid needless bloodshed. Needless. The old minister laughed scornfully, his white brows twitching in his long face. Bloodshed is not merely needed, it is imperative. A kingdom is ruled by force, not by words. Diplomacy is irrelevant. Ayodhya does not negotiate with rebels. I already know which band of brigands was responsible for this latest act of treason. You do? Beju blinked rapidly. But it was no band, Pradhan Mantri. Merely two young boys up to some childish prank. Again the open-mouthed laughter burst in his face, the white brows twitching. He could smell the Pradhan Mantri's breath. Surprisingly, the man retained most of his teeth in pristine white condition even at his age. Even though he must surely have been a good decade and a half past Beju's own age. Then again, Jabli was notoriously given to extolling the virtues of fasting and self-deprivation and their beneficial effect on one's atma and state of mind. When a man rarely ate, no wonder his teeth stayed as good as new. Come now, Gramarakshak Beju. I hardly expected you to be taken in by that subterfuge. I have received a full report. The boys were merely placed in the path to confuse you and your men. The real bowmen were concealed in the rocks and the surrounding jungle. After all, you don't really think that two little striplings could outshoot and outfight an entire entourage of the finest Purana Wafdars in his Lord Rama's force, do you? Beju wanted to start by protesting that since the very term Purana Wafadar meant old faithfuls, it ought to have implied that the force was made of exactly that, loyal veterans of previous wars, such as himself. The young, untried army regulars who had been enrolled into the elite force these past few years did not deserve to be called Wafdars, being as they were untested and untried in actual war conditions, and they most certainly were not Purana, none being over 30 years of age. While they looked and trained well enough to dissuade most potential attackers, in a pinch they were hardly the elite fighting force they were supposed to be. The truth of the matter was that the two little striplings had outshot and outfought the entire entourage. Despite the warning given by the boy who had so cleverly severed the horse riggings as Beju had attempted to break away, he had still followed the boy at a safe distance and arrived at the main length of the grama in time to watch the two young bowmen rout his men thoroughly in one of the most impressive displays of bowcraft he had ever witnessed. Not just one of, it was the most impressive display, apart from just one other previous display I once had the privilege of witnessing, when a certain other pair of bowmen engaged in a far deadlier battle a long time ago in a jungle called Bhayanakwan, against a Yaksi giant named Tatka. He kept all this to himself as he said aloud, "Actually, Pradhan Mantri, I think." But Jabli was already waving his crooked hand at him dismissively. "What you think is irrelevant. The culprits who did this must be roundly punished for this treasonous action. We must make sure that this entire colony of outlaws is dealt with once and for all." Colony? Surely he doesn't mean. Jabli's left cheek curled to reveal a brilliant white eye tooth. The so-called Maharshi Valmiki's colony of brigands and rogues masquerading as sadhus. They are behind the theft of the Maharaja's war wagon, and this time they have gone too far. They must be entirely wiped out, down to the last man, woman and child, and I shall see to it that it is done.